So today on the bench we have a very nice condition President HR2510 10-meter rig. This one's, like I say, really nice shape. It works. Customer just sent this in for basically its 100,000-mile tune-up. So replace the electrolytic capacitors and a transceiver alignment. And honestly, that's all it really needs. Only thing I'd recommend, depending on how much you have a radio turned on. The one thing you might want to consider if you own a radio like this, and they came in different versions, a couple different models. There's like President Lincoln, so there's different names, and especially depends on what country they were sold in. But the one thing to consider if you're going to have your radios turned on for long periods of time, change the light bulb to an LED. It's common on some of these radios, they stay on for really long times. It starts to get heat soaked because it is a light bulb. It's trapped in that little orange, I guess for a lack of better terms, orange condom. But it gets really hot. The rubber deteriorates, and then also this plastic housing over the decades of just being heat soaked, that can start to deteriorate the plastic. So it doesn't look like this radio actually was hardly ever used. It really doesn't look like it had much use. Just an easy way to tell is to look at that light bulb. For starters, it's the original light bulb. It's never been replaced. The rubber, umbrella, condom, whatever you want to call it, it's still in good condition. The plastic light shroud behind it, or reflector, is still in good condition. So you consider changing that over to an LED. Just save yourself some headaches down the road. Now, if you're going to work on one of these yourself, if you plan on replacing the electrolytic capacitors, I've had people ask me before about how do you work on that other board, or how do I get to the parts? All this stuff's in the way. Because, on the top side, there's not a whole heck of a lot you can do. Yeah, there's a lot of wires. Other than cut wire ties to gain access to get down in two parts, it's just kind of cramped. Welcome to my world. But on the other side, what you can do is what I did right here. Just take the board out. Everything plugs in. It's a modular board. It's meant to be installed and removed. It's darn near impossible to work on these otherwise. So I've actually already started. You can see there's a bunch of flying leads sticking up through the board there, because already a lot of electrolytic capacitors have already been replaced. Now, if you're concerned that you might somehow, if you leave these bundled like they are with the wire ties and just kind of disconnect it, pull it up and back, it's kind of hard to get the plugs wrong. There's a lot of different sizes, but by the same token, there are several that have 4 wires. So there's a 4-wire, there's a 4-wire, there's a 4-wire. So if you're afraid that you might get the wrong plug back into the wrong socket, a suggestion I would make is get yourself reach over here and grab one, a Sharpie. Nothing special, just a Sharpie. And what you want to do is, while you're unplugging them, just come up with some arbitrary little code, but use a different marking on every plug and every socket. So, and I did it on this one. Now, normally, I wouldn't do that because I'm used to it, but I thought, I'm going to be taking this board out, so I thought this is a good thing to show. Because like I said, I've had people ask me about that, or have contacted me and said, I recapped my radio, I pulled that board out, I don't know which plug goes where. They got mixed up in there. What direction do they go in? Where are they? And then you have to backtrace to figure out what goes where. So you can see here there's a little black dot right there. So there's just one mark on that. And then on this board, there's just one mark on there. The next one has 2 dots. And this plug or socket has 2 dots. And same thing. Maybe just one wide line with a dot on the end. But like I say, you can see I have wide line, dot on this end, just wide line in the middle, dot on each end, 3 dots, 1 dot here, and even your coax cables, like I say, they kind of fall into right where they go. But same thing, all you need to do is just just take your Sharpie and draw a single line on one of them. This one has a little black line right there if you can see it. But that indicates that goes to this socket that I drew a single line on. So that's a suggestion. Like I say, that'll prevent you from possibly getting them screwed up. So this way you can, if you need to, cut the wire ties off. You can pull all this stuff back and out of the way, and you don't have to worry about oh God, where does it go? Especially, now, in my case, it's one of those, I sit down, I'm going to do the radio, it'll be done in no time. But if you're working on your own radio as a project, and it's going to be sitting off to the side, yeah, you could forget if you pull all this stuff out, which one goes where. So, like I say, it's really simple. It doesn't cost, most people have Sharpies. So just put a couple little marks on there. It's not like there's 100 plugs on here, so it's easy to come up with a different little marking for each thing. If you have one of the rainbow packs of Sharpies, heck, you could put a different color marking on each one as far as that goes. Another thing to consider when you're working on these, there are a few other electrolytic capacitors on here that can be a little tricky to get to. You can see there's one there, and one here on these boards. Now, kind of hard to get down in there to some of these to desolder them. Don't even try. It's so easy to just desolder that board or that board. Just remove the solder. The whole board comes out. It's right there in front of you. You can change that cap. The other thing is the display board. Get it around the right direction here. It has 3 electrolytic capacitors on it as well. There's one crammed up underneath here, and there's 2 back here at the back edge. Now, you can dismantle the entire front of the radio to try and get to those electrolytic capacitors to desolder them. And you may have to do that. That depends on what equipment you have. If you actually have desoldering equipment, something like this, comes in many different forms, pistol grip styles. There's lots of different companies. But a lot of companies, now like this is a Pace. Pace has a lot of different tip options. Now this one's kind of fat and chunky. It holds a lot of heat, so it works really well, especially when you're working on trying to desolder something on a large ground plane. It has a lot of heat energy stored in that tip. So, as soon as the tip doesn't touch it, it doesn't soak it all out. And yeah, then the heater has to try and, it's pulling out of the reserve in the back here in the heating element, trying to, compensate for that. But like I say, the problem with these fat and short tips is when you're trying to get into something in an area like this, yeah, it's kind of clunky to use. So Pace makes limited access tips. Let me reach over here and grab some. They come in all different sizes and flavors. Main difference being, I'm just going to pull out a handful of them here out of my rack. Main difference being the hole size in them. But you can see the tip's longer, and it's a lot narrower. It's meant to fit down, and this one's actually the really restricted access one. This one right here has a tip that's perfectly fine for fitting over basically all the leads on this board. But you can see the hole sizes get bigger. This is for more like an IC. This one here is mainly designed for leads this size, and then this one would be for larger lead sizes. But like I say, now with something like this, because the tip's a little bit longer and it's a lot narrower, you can usually change those 3 electrolytic capacitors without having to dismantle the front of this radio. Just have to be careful, but luckily 2 of them are right at the back, basically in the middle. So they're fairly easy. You just stand the radio up on its edge. That's how I'm desoldering one of these. That's how it's sitting, like this. Desolder from one side, just pull the parts out from the other side. But what you can do is actually get down in here. But like I say, make sure you hold the wires out of the way, and they're back towards the back edge of the board here, but it's these 2 and these 2, so you can easily get down in there with your desoldering iron. The one up here at this front corner, that from the other side, is kind of right up underneath the cover right there. That one's a little bit more tricky, but if you're persistent, and you can pull this out of the way, and again, you can get down in here with one of these limited access tips. Just be careful. Don't go melting your wiring harness into a gigantic blob of shorted wires. You have no idea how many radios, and not just these, just all kinds, especially CB radios back in the day. Yeah, some of those radios, man, they were known for having a lot of wires, jumper wires on the bottom of a board. So, you wouldn't just have wires on the top. You'd have a bird's nest of wires on the bottom side of the board. When you're desoldering stuff, you always take a chance of running the desoldering tool into stuff, and you'll see radios, especially if they've been worked on a lot over the years, you'll see melted wires all over the place. So that's just something. Be careful. When you're doing limited access stuff like that, Worst case scenario, if there's really no way to do it, to get in somewhere, and you really don't want to take something apart, just because of the complexity of maybe getting that to that board to get to it, use a small piece of sheet metal. There's nothing saying you can't just cut out a little small piece of sheet metal, put that in here as a heat shield, as a guard, and then you can just slide your soldering iron right down that piece of metal then, and to get down to the actual leads to desolder them. So there's ways around it. But like I say, if you're using proper desoldering equipment, it's nice because a lot of the companies offer these limited access style tips that get really, really skinny. Now I don't use these all the time. A lot of people would ask, well, why don't I just use this kind of tip all the time? They don't last that long, in my world. Now, yeah, for the person that's only working on their own radios every once in a while, if you've bought an old desoldering system, because they do cost a lot of money when they're new. But if you picked up an old used one, a tip like this might last you your lifetime. For me, yeah, a tip like this, I'd be lucky to get a week. Well, nah, probably more than that. Probably 3 weeks to a month, somewhere around there. I would erode the center out of this thing in no time. Actually, I've noticed that I need to change this tip. Now, this one's been in here for months, but this tip is pretty much at the end of its life. And it may look fine, but if you look at the end, the hole in the middle is starting to get kind of big. When it started out life, it was, let me find a tip here, it would have been the same size. It would have started out with a hole that size. So the hole has opened up. It's starting to get to a knife edge on the end. I actually even filed the tip just slightly one time to try and get a little bit more life out of them, because these things are expensive. But what happens is, it's all the solder flux. It's not like it's erosion or wear from frictional wear. It's actually just the solder flux from when you're desoldering things. You gotta remember, the flux is a cleaner. It's etching the copper. Well, it's every time you suck something out, and these things are hot. It's just continually, there's always some flux residue in there all the time. It's always. Anytime you turn this thing on, it heats up, that flux gets activated, and it starts eating away at the copper, and eventually it just becomes hollow. And that's how I usually notice that it's about time to change the tip. When I'm desoldering, yeah, the solder just doesn't melt. You look at the, you look down at your temperature. Well, I got the temperature set right. Kind of be a fool to do it, but if you touch it and burn yourself, you go, yep, it's hot. But for some reason, you stick it on there, and you're trying, especially when you get into large ground planes, you're trying to desolder something like these little circuit boards that have a lot of solder buildup, and they're attached to really large ground planes. They stop the work. It's actually hollowed out inside. And I actually have an old one. I saved it because it actually makes a handy, very large terminal desoldering tool. But this is actually started out life the exact same size, sized for these little small wires. That's what it ended up as. Yeah. It still had a small hole at the end, but that's how much actually gets eroded out on the inside. And like I say, when it gets to that point, by the time you get out to the end, yeah, there's hardly any heat reserve there anymore. So, but I saved this one because this one's actually nice for doing really large terminals, or like if you're trying to remove, now not in this radio because they're all small, but if you're ever trying to remove these transformer cans, trying to get the ground lugs, they're kind of large. Make your own tips. A lot of times, like I say, you can save an old tip, and all I did to this one was just took it on a file, basically wore down through it a little bit till I got to that nice, to the where it had hollowed it out on the inside, and just made a new tip out of an old tip. So actually saved myself some money there. But so there's just a few tips on getting in when you're working on a radio like this. It's a good way to save a lot of money. That way you don't have to pay somebody else. You can buy cap kits on eBay, and you'll find junk ones and good ones. Read the people's listings. Do they tell you what kind of capacitors you're getting? If they tell you you're getting, Nichicon or Panasonic Matsushitas or Yagio, if they're good, if they tell you the cap kit has good high quality caps in it, you'll probably be fine. If they don't tell you anything in the description and it kind of looks like they're all cheap, no-name Chinese caps, well, they probably are, and you should avoid buying those kits. But there are good kits out there, so like I said, it's a good way to save money. You can work on your own radios. Now this one's a little bit more complicated, like I say, just because it's a 10-meter radio, has 2 circuit boards that are stacked. You've got a lot more wires, interconnect cables, so just be careful. Probably one thing I'll say, because I see it a lot actually, especially in this model of radio, the President Lincolns, all of the HR series radios, be careful with these coax connectors. Don't grab these by the wire and pull it out. Now, you might get away with that a couple times, but over the years of radios being worked on, if you grab these connectors, because they're just crimped on, okay, and it's an oddball connector. They can be had, but the crimpers for these things are woohoo expensive. And trust me, you ain't going to buy the crimper because it costs more than this radio. So just be careful. What I suggest is when you unplug these coax cables, use a pair of pliers and grab the metal, okay? Because it's only that much of it's actually going in to the socket down here. You can see there's a socket here and a socket here, and you can see it's just a little standoff at an angle on the board. So, like I say, don't grab the coax cable. Take a pair of pliers, and it's not like they're in there tight, but it's just over time, you pull these things out just one too many times, and once you rip the end off, yeah, you're screwed. I've seen people, and then people end up soldering the coax cables down to the board. Well, that makes servicing a nightmare then, because now instead of just being able to unplug everything, you have to desolder stuff every time you want to work on it. So, like I say, just use a pair of pliers, reach down in there, grab the back side of it, and pull it out like that. You don't need to squeeze really hard. Like I say, they're not a tight fit. It's just that's a lot of stress on that connection when you're pulling these out by the coax cables. So be careful with that, because I've seen that so many times. Kenwoods and other ham radios that use these, you don't see that much, because usually it's only techs that are working on radios when you get into the larger HF rigs. But these type radios, yeah, a lot of people do work on these themselves. So that's just a word of caution. Save those connectors. Try not to rip them off. So I guess that's about it. There's really not a lot to go over in these radios as far as tips and tricks. Just be careful with soldering. Now, if it's a used radio that's been well used, check all the solder connections. Once you get all the capacitors desoldered, your new ones stuffed in there, when you're soldering all your new caps in, just inspect the circuit board. Make sure there's no bad solder connections. These aren't too bad because they don't have a lot of really big capacitors hanging or a lot of big parts dangling off the board. Pretty much everything's fairly small in here. But just inspect your solder joints. So that's about it, I guess. Like I say, they're good, reliable radios. They're popular because they are such nice radios. They work really well. So there you go. President HR2510. Like I say, I kind of stopped in the middle of doing the cap job on this because I thought I'd show some recommendations. Because like I said, I know I've seen people get confused, and it seems so simple. It's just a couple plugs. Yeah, but like I say, 3 pins, 3 pins, 3 pins. 4 pin, 4 pin, 4 pin. Yeah, so there's a couple plugs in here that have the same amount of pins. If you get them mixed up, yeah, it can be a bit of a bugger trying to figure it out. So save yourself the hassle. Just make some little witness marks. Just save yourself a headache down the road. And not only that, once you get this board out, like I say, I've seen people try to work on this stuff in the radio. You're going to waste more time trying to do it that way than you are removing this board. Now you can just take out the 4 screws surrounding it. The board pulls out outside of the radio. You're not messing there trying to work on this thing standing up in the air, dangling by a bunch of wires. It's just a lot easier to work on. You can then stick this in a circuit board vise. It's right there in front of you, and you don't have to worry about it bouncing around on you. So there you go. There's just a few tips if you're going to work on one of these President-style radios. Like I say, they came in. There's several different versions. Like I say, they had Lincolns, and there's a couple of different HR models. But very reliable, good radios. They're popular for a reason. They work good. And actually, these are also very similar to the realistic HT X100s, also a 10-meter radio. Now, big difference there is they don't have AM, so they're sideband radios. But basically the layout's the same, the display, a lot of it, working on it. So everything that I covered here basically holds the same for those radios as well. Because like I say, they're pretty much the same. They're just a little bit. They don't have all the features that these do. So I hope some of that helps somebody out. One last thing I forgot, since I was going to kind of make this one a tips video on this style radio, is to remember that these circuit boards are double-sided. Well, actually, yeah, even this one, it's just the ground plane. But this board is double-sided. These aren't, but they do still use surface mount components. And as you can see here, we got little tiny parts. Actually, they're not that tiny. These are actually large as far as surface mount goes. But yeah, just something to keep in mind when you're working on these. That when you're doing your soldering, because a lot of these capacitors, one lead goes to or each side of like this one is also attached right onto surface mount components on the opposite side of the board. So the solder traces are really close together. You can see how close some of these are. It's really tight spacing under there. So just be careful when you're soldering them. Same thing with this board. Now this one is double-sided, so you can see it has circuit traces all along the top, and of course certain traces on the bottom. Now the top side of the board, this is all through-hole components, but the bottom side of the board, as you can see, is populated with all surface mount components. Doesn't have an excessive amount of them, mainly just resistors, diodes, and capacitors. I think there might be a few transistors on there. Yeah, but like I say, there's not an excessive amount, but it is double-sided. So just use caution when you're desoldering, removing old parts, and installing them, that you don't damage the traces. And one thing I recommend when you're soldering through plated holes and boards that are double-sided like this is add some flux. So my procedure when I normally change electrolytic capacitors, I replace all of them. One at a time, I'll go through, I desolder it, put the new one through, just slightly bend the leads over so it can't fall out. I replace all of them. Then I can just set the board down, or if it's the radio, I can just flip the radio and then solder everything. But before I solder anything when it's a double-sided board, I add a little bit of liquid flux. Now I just put it in these fingernail polish bottles because it does make very convenient dispensing, and I'm not pouring the flux onto the board. I mean, I got enough of, a lot of times these boards already are completely covered in flux residue that it needs to be cleaned off anyhow, so I don't need to be adding to the mess. But I just, you can mix up your own by pre-mix, liquid flux. No rocket science here. A lot of people just buy pure flux cakes, dissolve it in alcohol. I do that. I get actual little tins from Germany. It's called coliformium. And like I say, I dissolve that in isopropyl alcohol, or like this is made by Circuit Works. I mean, there's lots of different good liquid fluxes out there. But try, just do a little bit of research on it. Whenever you find one, try to find one that's meant for rework. Not just new work, but you want it for rework. They tend to be maybe a slightly tad bit more aggressive, which in a lot of times when you're working with stuff, you might have oxidation. So yeah, you need just a slightly more aggressive flux. But you don't want to go with one that's too harsh. So make sure it's surface, safe for use with surface mount components, and that'll always be in the data sheet. Usually it'll be in the item description, wherever you're looking for it. But like I say, just take your, like I say, I like the fingernail polish bottles. I know a lot of people use either syringes, dropper bottles, the syringe tip bottles. Over the years, I kind of discovered that, I needed to apply flux to two leads, like right here, and I ended up with a puddle that ran out to here. So it was dribbling off the edge, and it might have been coming around the other side of the board, getting into, stuff like connectors and places where I really didn't want flux in the first place. So, with a fingernail polish bottle, it's very easy just to brush on just a little bit, and really all you need is just enough to wick down in that hole. Because the flux will help with the wetting action, how the solder flows out. And you'll find if you try to solder, and you can even experiment, especially if you have an old junk board, it doesn't have to be one of these, just any circuit board laying around that's double-sided, try desoldering a lot of components, install a new part, and try soldering them, and then get some flux and try some more. And you'll find that when you use the liquid flux, you'll find the solder flows faster, and you'll see it as the solder starts to melt, and then all of a sudden it'll just disappear. And that's because the flux has helped to clean out, because that's what it does when you heat the flux up. It activates it, and it can clean any oxidation off. But you'll find your solder joints just look a lot better, and they're a more reliable connection then. You're making because you have to remember the process of soldering is not mechanical, it's on the molecular level. You're actually making new metals when you actually solder, because you're taking the copper and... Now, granted, the leads on all of these components are already plated, but it's an actual molecular process, soldering. It actually, you'll have so if you had two pieces of copper and you solder them together, with just your, normal everyday solder, what you're actually making is a new metal. You're going to have copper, whatever the composition is of your solder, it can be, 60-40 lead, 30, silver solder like I use. But it'll be a combination. That new metal will be a mix at the molecular level of the solder and the copper. So there's actually a boundary layer of new metal on the molecular level, because the molecules actually bind. And the flux is what helps to do that. It cleans off and gets rid of contaminants and lets that process happen, so you get a more reliable and a stronger connection. So, like I say, just a little tip I thought I'd add, because a lot of people might pull this board out and go, ew, surface mount. And same thing with these other little boards. So, yeah, and this is the only place in this style of radio you're going to find that is this one big board here, the processor board, and these two small boards here. So... just be aware of that. Don't have a heart attack when you lift this board out of its cage, especially, that, oh my God, it's not that bad. Just take your time. It's like with anything else. It never hurts to practice. So, like I say, that pretty much covers it with these radios. They're fairly straightforward, reliable, especially if they haven't been butchered before, which this one wasn't. Like I say, it's in really nice condition, works just fine, and we get done with it, will work even better. Be good to go for another, 25, 30 plus years with new caps in it, if not longer. And this thing, I did notice the frequency's off a little bit, not to be unexpected in a radio of this age. Crystals and components age over time, so you're going to get frequency drift. That's why every, so many years, and I'm not talking every other year, but, every 10 years or so, it's never a bad idea to have alignments done, because the crystals have aged, and you'll find that you're, continuously over the years, you're turning your clarifier a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more in one direction or the other. And that's because as components, and it's not just the crystals, resistors, capacitors, as a lot of those components age, within their tolerance, they're still a good part. It's just they've aged. It's kind of like, you and me. Components do the same thing. So there's just a few more tips.